I'm going to talk about the baseline monitoring we've been doing of endangered whooping cranes in the oil sands mining region since 2010. And I'm speaking on behalf of a group of colleagues who are indicated on the slide here. This work is really a team effort. We couldn't do this without the involvement of many people. So I'll start by giving some background information on whooping cranes. They're an iconic species. Most Canadians can recognize them as one of Canada's most endangered species. They are classified as a species at risk globally, in Canada, in the United States, and by many provinces and territories under a number of pieces of endangered species legislation, such as the Species at Risk Act. The whooping crane was assessed by a committee on the status of endangered wildlife in Canada as endangered first in 1978. That was most recently reassessed and confirmed in 2010 for two reasons. It has a small population size and it has a small distribution range. The meaning of endangered under Canadian legislation is that the species faces imminent extirpation or extinction. So it's a serious classification. Now, the Canadian population of whooping cranes, as I'll show you in a minute, is the only remaining self-sustaining and natural population of the species. It went through a demographic and genetic bottleneck in the early part of the last century, down to 14 individuals, 3 of which were females. More recently, it's been experiencing rapid growth on the order of 4% per year. And currently, there are about 330 individual birds and around 82 nesting pairs, which produce about 40 offspring every year. So it's a small population that's growing rather rapidly. Even though it's growing fast, it's considered to have a relatively high risk of extinction, even for an endangered species, and that's because it has a single small population. So a single natural disaster, weather event, oil spill, etc., could cause great damage to the population and thus to the species. So the Canadian population is known as the Aransas-Wood Buffalo population. The reason for that is that it breeds during the summer at Wood Buffalo National Park and in sites surrounding the park, and it winters at the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. So those two sites are indicated on the map by yellow stars. As I mentioned before, it's the only natural self-sustaining population remaining of this species. It's a migratory population. It spends approximately May to September in and around the park. Then it migrates in the fall to Texas, where it winters in and around the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. Then it comes back to Canada for the breeding season in the spring. Migration, for a number of reasons, is assumed to be the riskiest period for many species of birds generally, and for whooping cranes and other cranes specifically, in part because large-bodied birds especially will encounter hazards during the period of migration, such as power lines. One of the principal causes of mortality for these large-bodied birds is collisions with power lines. And in fact, Canada's recovery strategy for the whooping crane indicates that loss and degradation of migratory habitat are limiting for the recovery of the species. One potential hazard that many people have indicated for whooping cranes is the presence of oil sands mining in the migration corridor, indicated obviously by the red star. I just want to be clear about terminology because we use these terms differently in describing the areas that we work in. So I will refer throughout the talk to the mineable oil sands area. This is often called the surface mineable area, and I use the acronym MOSA. This is the area that's about 6 times the size of the city of Calgary. It's the area, obviously, where deposits are extracted using surface mining, and some of the features on the landscape include mines, tailings ponds, overburdened storage, and pit lakes. And so I'll refer to that area as the MOSA, and it's that small area indicated there at the just south of Wood Buffalo National Park. Again, the yellow star represents the approximate breeding range of whooping cranes in and around the park. The oil sands region generally is that much larger area, also indicated on the slide, approximately 4 times the size of Vancouver Island, where in situ methods are used to extract deposits. And features on the landscape in this area that are of note for wildlife generally and whooping cranes specifically are many linear features such as seismic lines, roads, pipelines, and power lines, and also well sites. You'll see this map or a similar one recur throughout the talk. So there's been much interest in the risk from some industrial sites in the mineable area and also in the broader oil sands region to migratory birds. One, but not the only one, is tailings ponds. These are numerous, extensive, and potentially toxic to wildlife. It's been estimated that the most recent estimates conducted by Colleen Cassidy St. Clair and her team at U of A are that there may be as many as 50,000 contacts between migratory water birds per year and tailings ponds. And sometimes those contacts result in mortality. The rates aren't very well understood yet, and those mortalities can be thought of as incidental mortalities, one or a handful of birds dying as a result of landing, or mass mortalities such as has been in the news. People are likely familiar with the mortality event in 2008 of 1,600 ducks on a Syncrude tailings pond. And spring weather, especially inclement spring weather, has been implicated in some of these mass landings. Ducks and other migratory birds forced to land on habitat that they otherwise wouldn't have selected during late spring storms. And there has been some speculation that not just smaller birds, but also whooping cranes might have trouble with tailings ponds. And this is a picture that was taken on the Platte River in Nebraska in fall migration in 2008 of oiled whooping cranes. And there was speculation at the time that these were oiled in the oil sands region, although there was no direct evidence of that. Feathers were collected from the birds. They were sent for contaminants analysis at the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and it was determined that the oil on the feathers was crude oil or another type of industrial oil. And as I say, there was some speculation that oil sands mining was involved, but the Platte River in Nebraska is pretty far from the oil sands region. Those birds had likely come through the oil sands region, but they'd also traveled through many other areas where they may have come into contact with those kinds of substances. Nevertheless, in 2011, U.S. environmental NGOs petitioned the U.S. government to certify that oil sands mining violates Canada's obligations to prevent take of migratory birds, including whooping cranes. Whooping cranes were cited in that petition. More recently, the Mikisew Cree Nation has petitioned the UN to certify Wood Buffalo National Park as a World Heritage Site at risk, in part, again, because of the potential risk from oil sands mining to whooping cranes. However, until now, we really had no ability to describe or quantify the potential risk from oil sands mining to whooping cranes, and so that's what we're trying to do here. The objectives of our baseline monitoring were in 3 parts. We wanted to investigate patterns of migration in the oil sands region and the mineable area. We wanted to learn about the migration corridor, timing of migration, occurrence, density, and frequency of use, stopover duration and proximity to industrial sites, and also something about basic habitat use and habitat selection in the region. We also wanted to evaluate risk. For example, do cranes land on tailings ponds? And do they die when they do that? And finally, we wanted to be able to try to provide some guidance to industry and government and other actors to try to help mitigate the risk if the risk is high. by, for example, informing environmental impact assessment processes, which we've done using some of the very early data from this project. So what did we do? Well, first of all, this is a cooperative study with 7 other Canadian and American partners. We use the data that we get from this study to answer a variety of questions that are not all related to oil sands mining, so we couldn't really do this type of project without working collaboratively and cooperatively. Very expensive to do the kind of work we're doing. And it's expensive because it involves catching whooping cranes and putting satellite trackers on them. And this has some advantages. This approach has some advantages. It allows us to collect data in remote areas and throughout the annual cycle. And this allows us to have a relatively unbiased view of the risk posed by various hazards. We're not relying on human observers who happen to see a whooping crane land on a tailings pond, or who happen to observe a whooping crane in another industrial type of habitat. We are able to follow them and know where they go, regardless of where they go or when they go there. We banded 68 cranes with these transmitters. 31 of them were caught at Wood Buffalo and 37 in Texas. And those transmitters provided us with between 4 and 5 GPS locations every day. And then we used those data to monitor migration and survival since 2010. And that allowed us to specifically monitor 231 migrations through the oil sands region. And then we also used field surveys, so biologists out in the field, either in aerial surveys or ground surveys, to recite individually banded birds to estimate the survival of birds that had lost their transmitter, or in some cases the transmitter failed, but the birds are still uniquely marked, so we can learn something from their marks, or also unbanded juveniles accompanied by banded adults. So we're using the banded adults as proxy marks for the juveniles. It allows us to bump our sample size a little bit. So this is definitely a catch and release project. We have to catch the cranes and then release them. All of this work is supervised by a wildlife vet. On the right is Barry Hardup from the International Crane Foundation in Wisconsin, and he comes to Wood Buffalo as a member of our capture team. On the left is Felipe Chavez Ramirez, who is a Mexican-Texan crane biologist. And those 2 gentlemen form part of our 6-person capture team, which also includes Canadian biologists. And I'm just going to show you a brief 1-minute video of the release of this whooping crane, which we caught just outside Wood Buffalo National Park in 2012. So the crane has its bands, and it has the satellite transmitter affixed to it. You'll see the bands on the bird. And it's being gently released by Barry and Felipe back into the wetland adjacent to the site where the bird was captured. Often you would hear the parents of the bird calling the juvenile back to them. In this case, they were a little bit far off for the camera to pick that up. That's Barry doing up the zipper on his backpack. Anyway, once the bird is released, we are able to start collecting data from the bird, and we do that by downloading information that is uploaded from the bird to a satellite. So the GPS data goes from the bird to the satellite, and then every few days we're able to download it to our computers. And so I'd like to turn now to examine the results of the baseline monitoring that we've done. And the maps here are familiar from the last few days, and sessions earlier today, certainly. And from earlier in this talk, I've indicated the mineable area and the oil sands region. And the main point here is that the migration corridor of the cranes included the entire oil sands region and the MOSA in both spring and fall. And the migration corridors that you can see there are differentiated by age. So the green corridors are corresponding to juvenile birds, and the gray corridors are corresponding to older birds. But you can see that whether you're a young bird or an old bird migrating in spring or fall, you could be anywhere in the mineable or the broader oil sands region. You're at risk of being in that area. Now, although you could be anywhere there, you're not likely to be anywhere. You're likely to be in specific places, and that's what this next slide shows. This is a density map. It's a 20 kilometer by 20 kilometer grid, and we've simply summarized the density of GPS locations that we obtained from sampled birds. And this indicates that in the MOSA, cranes are both more widespread and densities were higher in spring than fall. But you can see that in both spring and fall, cranes are flying and sometimes landing directly over the surface mineable area. So this slide shows the temporal aspect of migration, and on the x-axis is time, so those bars represent months, and on the y-axis is an index of abundance. We call it proportional abundance. It's the proportion of marked cranes that were in the area within a certain month. And then again, it's broken down by age class, so adults and juveniles. But the take home here is that cranes, well, first of all, the period of migration in spring is shorter than in fall. Cranes can be in the oil sands region for about 45 days in spring and for about 70 days in fall. And second, that cranes can be in the oil sands region in late April during periods of bad weather, which could, as is the case, or as is believed to be the case for other migratory birds, could increase their chance of landing generally and on tailings ponds. So with respect to frequency of use and stopovers, we determined that almost all cranes migrate through the broader oil sands region. Most of them migrate through the MOSA, and smaller numbers of cranes stop over in the MOSA. About 15% in spring or fall will land in the MOSA. However, cranes that are young, so juveniles and subadult cranes, are about 4 times more likely to stop over in the MOSA than older cranes. Stopovers are usually short and far from tailings ponds. They will spend between 1 to 2 nights at a site in the MOSA. And as I say, those are generally pretty far from a tailings pond. However, we did detect that some cranes land on or adjacent to tailings ponds or other industrially modified sites. And so I'd like to show you a couple of pictures of that. So this is a stopover that occurred earlier this fall in September on the Athabasca River, and this is what we like to see. So this is a crane using a natural habitat. Cranes often roost overnight on sandbars or islands in rivers. We see that around Saskatoon, where I live, all the time. We have both whooping cranes and sandhill cranes overnighting on the South Saskatchewan River. This is a very common pattern for cranes. And here's a stopover also from earlier in the year on a natural wetland, albeit one fairly close to a seismic grid. This is what is of greater concern. So a crane in 2014 stopped over at Shell's Muskeg River mine. On the left, I've indicated basically a tailings disposal area, which includes both fluid and sand contaminants. And on the right is an open pit mine. The white dot indicates the location of the crane, and this is just a zoom in on that same plot. And it turns out that this crane roosted in a wetland, overnight in a wetland adjacent to a road that connects the mine to a tailings pond. So this is not a tailings pond itself, but it is very clearly an industrially modified site near a tailings pond. In this case, the crane stopped over on a tailings pond at Syncrude's Mildred Lake mine. This tailings pond is now an end pit lake. The white dot indicates the position, and I'm going to zoom in on it now. So this is a subadult crane which roosted overnight on a little wetland that was connected to this tailings pond. Now, we've subsequently looked back at whether there were deterrents in place, and there were in fact deterrents right at this very location. And so this raises some questions about the efficacy of deterrence and monitoring programs for migratory birds in this area, because these birds, to our knowledge, were not detected by the on-the-ground monitoring program. I'll just very briefly touch on habitat use, because I'm running out of time. We have determined that cranes tend to select habitats that we are not at all surprised that they select. So they're using fens, marshes, and open water, and these are the habitats they use in the breeding grounds and in the wintering grounds. And cranes tend to avoid upland habitats and anthropogenic areas. So that last set of bars on the right-hand side that is indicated other, in the habitat classification that we have used, that class includes oil sands mining developments. So we see, on the one hand, cranes tending to avoid industrial areas, but on the other hand, in some cases, cranes landing and stopping over in industrial sites. Just finally, I'll turn to the question of survival and whether or not cranes die as a result of migrating through oil sands regions. We did detect mortalities in this study. So we had 17 mortalities up to mid or late 2015. 15% of those birds died during migration, which makes up about 17% of the year. So this calls into question the longstanding belief that migration is the riskiest period of the year. Mortality seems to be in proportion to the amount of time cranes spend in migration. We monitored 231 migrations in the OSR and 194 in the MOSA. We didn't detect any mortalities of banded cranes in the OSR or in the MOSA. And the majority of juveniles, of the unbanded juveniles with banded parents, also survived the period between late August and late September, which of course includes migration through the OSR. So our conclusion from this is that survival seems high during this period, which on the face of it is very good. On the other hand, there are a couple of caveats. Mortality, we believe, of an individual of a very rare species would be, by definition, a rare event and might go undetected. And so there's a question of detectability and detection rate. Are we sampling enough to detect what would be, again, by definition, a very rare event? And the second caveat is that if cranes are landing on tailings ponds and potentially becoming contaminated by material in the ponds, there could be sublethal effects of that behavior, and we have not studied that, and we have no information on it. So finally, to conclude, we know from this baseline monitoring that most of the cranes migrate through the OSR and the MOSA. Fewer land in the MOSA. Most of their stopovers are short and far from tailings ponds. However, some stopovers do occur on or adjacent to tailings ponds. Survival seems high, but detectability is unknown, and also unknown are the potential sublethal effects of stopping over on these industrial sites. And the next steps for this study are that we have, or for this work, are that we have proposed a focus study to run for the next 3 years. We want to propose to focus on young cranes because they are the most at risk of landing in the oil sands region. They have the highest mortality rates of any age class of cranes, and they are also the main drivers of the population growth rate in this population. Recent demographic models have shown that recovery of the species is really going to depend on survival of young birds. So we think this is a useful sort of narrowing of the objectives of the study to try to focus on these young birds. What we really want to do is now move from baseline monitoring to increase our understanding of some of the mechanisms and consequences of the use of these industrial areas by whooping cranes. And so we have proposed to test a number of hypotheses, specific hypotheses, to both quantify and help mitigate risk to this endangered species. So I'm out of time. If you have questions, I suspect Bruce will want you to ask them of me later. And just finish by thanking you for your attention during my talk.